Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Puppet Masters and Castle Freaks, the internet's leading and possibly only all things Charles Band podcast. I am one of your hosts, Jared Hornbeck, and I might be coming to you now from Brooklyn, New York, but don't worry, I will haunt these podcast apps for 1,000 years. But I'm not going to be haunting them alone. Who is here with me?
Well, howdy, partners. It's Steve Guntley, and I can spot a thirsty man about a mile. This is the podcast about phantom cowboys, skeleton jails, and a whole lot of rootin' tootin'. That's because this is a podcast all about Ghost Town, which is a cult kind of empire oddity over here that's become sort of a sought-after movie in a lot of ways. It's become a little bit hard to find, and I think it's kind of a cool little banger of a movie. But we are not going to be talking about this alone. Who else is here in the old haunted barn with us?
Well, you used a great word there, Steve. You called this movie an oddity, and in order to fully discuss it, we had to bring in another oddity to do that. So we pulled him straight from the Mates of Hell. You've probably heard him on the Brain Rot podcast. Also, another podcast that he has called X Rental, which is about just those nostalgic trips down memory lane in video stores. Probably, the early 90s and maybe even before, but just a perfect really fit for the kind of things that we bring to the table in our show here. Brad Hanson is here. Brad, what's going on, dude?
Howdy, partners. That'll be the first and last time I do that.
I can say I live in Texas, and I can say you nailed that.
Thank you.
That was perfect.
I've been practicing all day.
Yeah. And as a big city slicker over here, that's how I imagine everyone in Texas sounds.
Yeah, pretty much.
All the time.
That's what we do. Yeah, every one of us. We are very excited to have you, Brad. Thank you so much. Thank you for bringing this movie to our attention. And I'm curious about how you came across this movie and a little bit of your experience with horror in general.
So Ghost Town specifically was a relic of the VHS rental store era, as you mentioned and touched upon, Jared, there. I do a podcast called X Rental where we look back at 90s video store culture, and although we could never cover Ghost Town because we'd set ourselves a difficult trap of only doing films from the 90s for some reason, it's a VHS artwork cover that was sort of seared into my brain from a very young age. The kind of six shooters in the eyes, there's an evocativeness to it that I think, especially as a burgeoning child, and you mentioned City Slickers as well, was a staple of my growing up. Those sort of convergences of Western and horror as a kid really appealed to me. So when you sent through the list of what was available, and some of your other guests have picked some absolute Charles Band Empire Picture bangers, this was one that I was immediately drawn to.
I think it was a great pick. This is one that was absolutely not on my radar until very coincidentally like a month ago, because I, on a whim, purchased a hard copy of the Leonard Maltin Film Guide, which I had not done in maybe 20 years. I'm just like, I want this on my shelf again. And I was just flipping through it as one is likely to do, and I came across Leonard Maltin's review of Ghost Town, which was a 3 out of 4 stars, incidentally. He liked this movie. He called it a modest, ambitious little sleeper, and that put it on my... And I'm like, oh, okay, what is this movie? And then I went down my IMDb rabbit hole and discovered, oh, we actually will be talking about this. So it was a very cool find. But it's a really weird, really fraught... actually unfinished movie, which is kind of the weird thing. I think this movie kind of looks and flows a lot better than a lot of the other movies we cover, but technically this movie is not finished. Is that right?
Yeah, it is, Steve. And it's interesting that there are aspects of its unfinishedness that we'll definitely talk about. Before we talk about that, I want to know, though, what year is this Leonard Maltin guide? Is this a recent one? Is this a new one?
I think the most recent one is from, I want to say 2016. I think they stopped publishing it after that, but that is the most recent one.
I'm gonna have to get one of those on my shelf because that was my very easy to call Christmas stocking gift every year from 1993 to 2002 probably. Was that big brick of a book just sitting there weighing my stocking down with that little thumbtack holding on for dear life with that one. Yeah. But I do need to get some of those back. They've all been lost to time in a series of moves that I've had. But yeah, this movie, it's really interesting because it has a cool premise. And we talk a lot about Charles Band's school of filmmaking, which is you get a poster and you sell a poster, and then you come up with a story and a script later on. And the cover art to this, both the American cover art, which I think was the skeleton with the spurs and cowboy hat on, and then the cover art that followed, which is the big skull with the barrel of the guns for eyes.
Yeah.
Both awesome. Both like super cool and memorable. And I was having a conversation a while back with Adam Torkel, who was our guest for the Ginger Dead Man and Ginger Dead Man 2 episode. And he was talking about Ghost Town also from the artwork. And so this was one that was popping up in my radar, but overlooked by me. I hadn't actually seen this movie. I had only heard of it. I had only seen it in probably some collective of VHS cover artwork before. And I was excited that we were going to get to cover it. And then I was excited, Brad, to find out that you chose this, but also because you had a history with it, which is really fun, because some people choose the movies blindly. It's always fun when we get somebody who is bringing something with them to it. Like they chose this one for a reason. So I'm very happy about that. But this thing is so unfinished, even down to the score. There's no original score to this movie, which I think is hilarious. It's just Ghoulies 2 music being reused. There was something else too. There's another one besides Ghoulies 2. I forget which one it was, but it's a well-known
like
one.
Deep stock library, like Empire stuff. Yeah. And I think they completed like, the composer says he has like 3 little sections of his original music that are in the movie, but you can really hear it. It's like wildly inconsistent from moment to moment. Like it just doesn't seem to flow at all, which is just really interesting. Let me dig into a little bit of the production of this movie, because this is a weird one. So Ghost Town was released November 11th, 1988. It's directed by Richard McCarthy, and it's written by Duke Sandifer from original story by David Schmoller. And it stars Frank Luce, Catherine Hickman, Jimmy F. Skaggs, and Bruce Glover. All right, I want to talk about this Richard McCarthy person, because he's even referred to, Jared was kind enough to share the chapter on this from Empire of the Bees with me, and he is even mentioned in that book as a mystery man. All right, this is his one and only feature film that he ever directed. The only other things he has on his credits are 2 Benny Hill specials that were released in Australia. That's weird. That is a weird fucking catalog. And then to just like disappear. Like apparently he had a terrible time making this movie. Originally, David Schmoller was attached to direct this film, but he was fired for unknown reasons and replaced with Richard McCarthy, who decided to go by the name Richard Governor here. Don't know why. And then McCarthy himself walked off the film 2 weeks before the end of shooting, and so the final film had to be completed by Mac Ahlberg, who we talked about many times. He's the great Swedish cinematographer who's worked on a lot of different films here. So the reason that this movie kind of looks good and has any kind of flow at all is because Mac Ahlberg kind of came in and did the final bit. But Empire was literally crumbling around the production of this movie. They were running out of money, and so they were just being rushed to finish this before like they went bankrupt. And so the movie that they got out into theaters was an unfinished work print. And I believe that's still the version of the film that we have today. Like there are some special effects that aren't done. There's music tracks that aren't done. Lots of big gaping plot holes that are never really resolved. But Empire made the poor decision to open this in a limited release on the same day as Child's Play. You know, if you're putting 2 horror movies back to back, I'm sorry, I'm going to go see Chucky, you know. So that kind of wiped it out. And unlike a lot of other Empire films, it never really found its audience on home video. And these days, it's become rather hard to find. Didn't you say, Jared, that you found like a Blu-ray, but it was like $200 or something like that? First
and foremost, though, given the Benny Hill background, there's a disappointing lack of both yakety sax and bikinis falling off of people in this movie, which is what you want, you know, if somebody is helming such a product. But yeah, I was looking for this one.
Movies would be enhanced by including a little bit of yakety sax, like just a little bit.
I'm inclined to agree with you. But I think, I was looking for this one on Prime Video. It wasn't available on the Full Moon streaming app, on Tubi, any of those wasn't available. So I was like, all right, well, you know, we've got a few weeks before we were going to sit down and record this. Let me see if I can or just order a copy of it and have the Blu-ray. No harm in owning the Blu-ray of it. Very much harm in owning the Blu-ray of it. If you want to spend less than $200 or so in the States to have a copy of this, is Out of Print Scream Factory. Now, Brad, You said this is put out by a company called 88 Films, I believe. Tell us a little bit about that company, because that's a release I'm not familiar with.
So 88 Films are sort of doing one of the leading UK genre picture releasing companies. They have a section that's entirely dedicated to slashers. They have a European section as well for like predominantly Italian horror as well. And they released Ghost Town on one of their Vault labels, which is something that doesn't quite fit into slasher. It doesn't fit into that. It fits into, like, they put street trash out, and the kind of films that don't really fit but are genre pictures.
Sure.
So it's a lot more readily available. Still not that available in the UK, but still more readily available. So I managed to get it online and share it with you two, because sharing is caring, obviously.
We
Very
greatly
appreciative.
appreciate it, yeah, because this would have been really hard to find. We were even like, all right, we might need to make some alternate pitches. Like, we may not be able to find this, so I'm glad that we were able to get a chance to see it. Yeah, it's a pretty fun movie, honestly. Like, I think this is a movie that's got a lot of great texture. I think it's got I mean, I don't know why more people don't pursue the horror Western genre, because I feel like those are two great tastes that taste great together. I think that's just like a really nice fit. You know, you take a very desolate, isolated, aggressive setting and then add a supernatural twist to it. I mean, it always works.
Yeah, I mean, this thing plays in a lot of ways like a slightly overlong Tales from the Crypt episode or
Yeah.
Twilight Zone episode, and it's like I could see this being a super cool episode of an anthology series if it was edited down and cleaned up a little bit, because like you said, this is an awesome aesthetic. Say what you will about this movie in terms of the story and obviously problems with production and plot holes, etc.
Yeah.
The look of this movie is not something that you're going to complain about or nitpick about it. And I think it's a really a wonder that this is not tapped into more, because the desolate setting of the horror Western, you get, I don't know. I mean, it's, you know, we've heard them referred to as by some people as these low budget one set wonders.
Yeah.
And you can do a lot with one set in this movie. And I think they do. I mean, this is totally backlot. This was shot, I believe, in Arizona. So they were, you know, set up this one little section of the Western town, and that's all you really need. I mean, this is not any worse production wise, at least in terms of how it looks, than your average episode of Walker, Texas Ranger, or Briscoe County Junior, or something where you can see somebody traveling through this town. And another movie that we talked about that we really loved, and Brad, I don't know if you're familiar with this one, maybe you are, but Oblivion.
I was just going to bring up Oblivion too, because I think when you compare, and like I said, we had a lot of fun with Oblivion, but that is a movie that looks like it was shot on like a Disneyland kind of set, you know, like it's a facsimile of an old Western town. And I think that whatever sets they built here for Ghost Town, and with the addition of the actual authentic like Arizona backgrounds, I think that just gives it a lot more. Like, I think putting that much more attention into the production design really kind of paid off here. I will say, you know, this is a movie that's got some odd script problems. You know, like the director reportedly walked off because he was either changing too much or wasn't changing enough. I don't know. He wanted to improvise a little bit more. So there was a dispute over the script and over the story beats. And this cast is very odd too. Like nobody on this cast really went on to anything big. We know Jimmy F. Skaggs, of course, from The Puppet Master, and you know, he's had parts in movies like what did I watch him in recently? Cutthroat Island. He's got a little bit in Cutthroat Island, which is a very
Also in Oblivion.
Also in Oblivion, that's right. Yeah. A little bit of a racially insensitive turn in Oblivion, unfortunately, but
Fair.
The main guy here is Frank Luce, who I was not familiar with. He's been retired since 1999. Looks like he's had a couple of small parts in movies I've seen, like When Harry Met Sally, you know, but like nothing really memorable. But I dug a little deeper. He actually originated the role of Orin Scrivello, the evil dentist, in Little Shop of Horrors, in its original like off-Broadway production. So that actually endears him a lot to me. I'm like, all right, that's my favorite musical, and if he's the original one, that's pretty cool. And Catherine Hickland, who plays the captured girl here, honestly, at this point, she was only better known. She was really only known as Mrs. David Hasselhoff. She had an appearance on Knight Rider, became like a bit of a recurring role, and she and David Hasselhoff got married off of that. And I think they got divorced the year after this movie came out. But she's another one who just doesn't really work anymore. But
Yeah,
of course,
they
we
were
do have Bruce
married.
Glover, yeah.
When this movie was made, they were married, and she has one of my favorite pieces of IMDb trivia, which is that she was married to David Hasselhoff, who played a character named Michael Knight on Knight Rider. And then after she divorced David Hasselhoff, she married a man whose real name was Michael Knight.
Yeah. And he had a talking car, too, which was really, that's more of a coincidence, really. But she's got a type. You know, so, but I mean, the cast here was fun. And in, like, we fill up the movie with all of these great, like, Western stock characters. You know, there's like the madam with the heart of gold, and like there's the old blind blackjack dealer, and like and of course Jimmy F. Skaggs is playing the Black Bart, you know, evil black hat guy, you know, who just happened to have made a deal with Satan to exist in this kind of like permanent state of limbo. Am I understanding the plot right?
Yeah, I think that's about the long and short of it, at least for what we're given here. There's no, like, my understanding is that Richard Governor, it's so funny because he's kind of like the D.B. Cooper of like movie directors, where no one really knows whatever came of this person. And when you hear people talk about him in retrospect, a lot of people say that he was not a qualified person to be making this movie or to be behind the camera shooting this movie. And it almost strikes me as if he was like this guy who accidentally found his way onto a film set and was able to fake it until he could make it, and like till they finally found him out and forced him off. But my understanding is that he was having the actors improv a lot. And you were saying before, Steve, that you weren't sure if it was too much or too little. I think it was too much. I think it was, he was just changing the script. And then finally at the end, it was like Mac Allberg just had to direct what was remaining and get this thing into some form that it could release in theaters. And it's got, I hate saying this, kind of pun intended, but like it's got the skeleton or the bones of a pretty good movie, but it's very much I'm going to do it again, it's not fleshed out, much like its cover art. Sorry, I'm sorry everyone
today, aren't you?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's an odd one, right? Because what I quite admire about the film is it doesn't muck around. You know, a lot of films, they'll set up a law or something for the reason, like, don't go over there, there's something weird. But instead, you know, we see Kate running away from her wedding, and the next thing you know, there's a big dust cloud, and she's dragged off into the netherworld of this alternate town. I love a film that doesn't make me sit through 20 minutes of exposition before we even get to the kind of meat of the story. And then, obviously, Langley, the sheriff, he gets immediately dragged into it in the next sort of 5 minutes, and then we're in. But the problem is, when we get in, it feels like the film doesn't know what to do. It's just waiting for these plot beats to happen so that we can have this showdown. And it's all just building to this. We talked before we started recording about Cyborg. That's another film where it's just like fucking checkpoint, like almost like a video game where you're just like, we're just getting to the next one till we get to the boss fight, basically.
Yeah. There's definitely a bit of that, and there's a bit of a kind of wayward energy in the middle act of this movie, where it's just sort of like, all right, let's find what's going on here. Let's here's some scenery for Jimmy to chew on a little bit. You know, crunch, really tasty. And then we're just kind of like, but I think this has kind of the spirit. Like, weirdly, the movie I kept thinking of when I was watching this was Sam Raimi's The Quick and the Dead, because similarly, these are very stagey westerns that are like kind of unironic, but also just sort of like boiling down the western genre to its like core essence, at least in the core like stereotypes of it, you know. And it's having fun in this kind of heightened way. So I just enjoyed kind of being in the world of this movie, you know. Like you have Crispin Glover's dad as the weird like blind blackjack dealer who also seems to know everything, and like there's just a weird vibe in this movie that's enjoyable to kind of hang around in. You do wish that there was just a little bit more momentum, but I think the showdown at the end does kind of pay it all off.
It's an odd route of how we get from introduction to the town to the showdown. A stagey is a good word.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of like we're here, then we're here, then we're here, then we're here, and there's a piecemeal feeling to it, which I think makes complete sense when you read about the production of the movie. I think like Steve texted me off mic and was like, before I shared anything from the book with him, and he was like, was this a troubled production?
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, it was. I mean, and there's, if you really want to nitpick and something like that, and we've, when we started this show, I feel like we were a lot more pedantic, where we were nitpicking little things. And as the show's gone on, we've been able to highlight things we appreciate more about the movies than nitpick things that don't work. And there's continuity mistakes in the beginning of this movie. There's a weird sequence of shots. It's day and night and day again. It's the way the opening credits look. It's kind of and not the most professional looking initially. Like I remember my first instinct during the credit sequence was like, I don't really know what to make of this. This could be a painful 85 minutes. But then by the time the sandstorm rolls in, and like you said, we're thrust into the action really fast, I was like, oh no, this is cool. This is going to get us to here. And I appreciate some of the makeup work and the sets and the costuming for a low budget movie like this. It's just narratively, there are holes, and there are some large holes, and it kind of, we jump rather hastily from, and I hate that this is even happening, but remind me of Frank Loza's character's name again?
Langley. Yeah.
Langley. So yeah, Langley showing up in the town to then waking up to the daughter of the blacksmith, who's kind of, doing the Lorraine McFly scene with him, where she's like, oh, what's your name? Calvin Klein. But she's taken his pants off, and we get her backstory in that scene too. And then it kind of hastily jumps to another scene. I think this movie, it presented the way it was, doesn't give us quite the time to breathe in some of these scenes maybe that we mean. But I mean, this is a lean, mean 85-minute Empire movie, which is what we've really come to expect. It's interesting to think if this were a 95-minute movie, would this be better or worse? I don't really know.
Yeah.
To be honest with you.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's at the right place, but just that it falls into kind of like this nebulous zone where like it's a slick looking, like professionally done movie that has a couple of flaws, but it's basically in the ether. When this came out, it made less than $100,000. It clearly cost more than that. A lot of Empire or Full Moon productions around this time, you could argue that maybe it costs less, but this one looks like it has some money on screen. And it just kind of disappeared. And the fact that nobody capitalized on it on home video or a DVD market means there was probably a little bit of like behind the scenes sort of squabbling over the rights, or it may be unclear who owns this at this point. But it's just a movie that is sort of, well, it's kind of a phantom, if I'm going to continue Jared's thread of using awkward ghost puns. Yeah, so it's cool to see it, like, even in its awkward kind of nascent state.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm putting a lot of blame on this Richard McCarthy / Richard Governor guy, because I was reading an article about Empire's history in Delirium magazine, and in that he is interviewed saying that Empire wanted him to take a pseudonym. He was a Clio Award-winning filmmaker. He was like a television commercial guy. And I guess maybe...
Is that what Clios are, their commercials?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay,
and
I guess I never knew what those were.
Yeah, he apparently directed a commercial that beat out a commercial directed by Alan Parker and one directed by Ridley Scott.
Wow.
In 1982, which is kind of his claim to fame. But he seems to think like Empire had no faith in him. But given what we're told about how the way he handled this, I don't know. It really took Mac Allberg doing a lot to get this thing resembling a movie, and it just sounded like somebody who came in and decided they were going to make too many decisions on their own. I mean, Empire is Empire. It's not like this is a big studio where the studio heads are coming in and looking at the dailies and saying, oh, don't do this, change this. I mean, these people have like a lot of freedom, and it's like this script that was based on a story by David Schmoller was apparently being changed a lot.
Yeah.
And so I am falling on the side of where, unless I talk to Richard Governor himself, which I don't think is possible, actually, because I'm starting to think that he himself might be an apparition, then I'm falling on the side that he kind of was running this thing into the ground and it needed to be salvaged. That's the side I'm taking on it.
There was a brief interview I found with Frank Luce where he said that this guy was really charismatic, just came in, was this kind of lusty bon vivant type. So maybe he's just sort of a con artist on a lark who kind of came in, is like, oh yeah, why not? I talked my way onto a movie set just through sheer magnetism, and same way I got onto the Benny Hill shoot, So yeah, maybe that's what he did, and then he's just gone off and done something else cool. Yeah. I don't know if I have too much more about Ghost Town. Did we have anything else we wanted to add?
Well, I think this is a fascinating relic from this time. I think there are so many movies that come to mind, and I think that was sort of what jumped out at me as being that Brad mentioned this one, because I'll be honest, from the paragraph long thing I sent him of movie comma of all of these things that he wrote back so quickly with Ghost Town, I was like, man, that's interesting. I was not expecting that. I was expecting that to be one that was going to have to be given to someone. And then going back and feeling like, oh, wow, this is a hard to find movie. And then going back to Empire of the Bees, and then Brad being kind to share the movie with us, watching the film. It's one of those ones that's really fascinating, in my opinion, to think and talk about, maybe more so than it is to watch in terms of a movie, because again, it's very episodic, it's very piecemeal, it's a little bit scattershot, but I think anything, it's a real microcosm of the fallen empire.
Yeah,
it's a microcosm of the end days of empire. And Brad, I'm just curious, now you said you were familiar with this movie, but did you have were you familiar with it more by reputation, or is this something that, you sought out and then showed it to friends and said, oh, you got to check out this Ghost Town movie? Or was it, you were just clamoring to get on a public space and talk about it?
I think for me, as I say, it's a film from the VHS era that I've definitely rented and have forgotten completely everything about. Even back then I was watching too many films. So this felt like an opportunity to revisit something that I haven't seen in probably 20 odd years, at least. It's an interesting one, because if you put this into historical context, we're at 88 at this point. So slashers are dying. Slasher slump. Yes, we've got Child's Play. It's come up against Child's Play. That kind of breathed a bit of new life into the genre, but horror generally is kind of on a downward trajectory. If you take Empire out of this completely, horror itself is kind of festering, and it seems like such an odd choice that if you can't even get straight up kids and a killer movies to get butts on seat, why you would then combine it with a notoriously difficult Western setting, something that hasn't at this point really been effectively utilized. Maybe Near Dark is about as close as you've got to a horror Western at this point.
Yeah.
Later on, you get things like Dust Devil, Richard Stanley's Dust Devil. Get Nothing But Trouble is kind of Western adjacent with Dan Aykroyd and John Candy. And you obviously get the more contemporary horror westerns that you get now with Bone Tomahawk and The Wind and those sort of films. But it's an interesting thing that this film exists in the time that it does, when horror itself was so... Even the most straightforward of horror films were failing. For them to do this big a swing, I think is just a fascinating sort of chamber piece of a bygone era, because no one would take a swing like that now.
It is it is worth remembering. This was probably 88 to 96 was a time when horror was not a guaranteed hit. Prior to that and after that, there was you can pretty much always make money on a horror film, but that was kind of this weird little dead zone in the early 90s when people just weren't turning out for it. until kind of Scream came along and just said like, oh, okay, we can contextualize this, we can still enjoy it. So yeah, it is interesting to think like so many different horror movies are just sort of either lost or off your radar, and they're not even that old of movies. And I think this is kind of a good example of that, sort of a victim of the waning popularity of the genre.
Yeah, and 88 is such an interesting year because, you know, we just did a guest spot on The Cradle to the Grave talking about Black Roses from 88. And 88 to me, when I think of like Hellraiser, Hellbound, Hellraiser 2 and Black Roses, and then Nightmare 4 and Friday the 13th 7, it was just it was the year when things really started to turn, where I think in a way it was almost going to take high concept to get something like to make your movie stand out, because like we mentioned, the slashers were waning at that time. Things were getting more into the supernatural, into a little more ephemeral, a little bit more cerebral, a little bit darker. And it wasn't just so much like, oh, here's a bunch of dead meats together with somebody hacking kids up in the woods. Like that wasn't really flying anymore by that time. And I always, as a child of the 80s into the 90s, I always had this weird bias where I felt like if you look at Nightmares 5 and 6 and Friday 7 and 8, they kind of signify the genre dying. But I think it died in a way like maybe some of the major franchises died.
Yeah.
But it definitely changed. And I've been recently reassessing stuff from the early 90s. Like I've gone back and I always had this bias of like 90s stuff sucks. Pre-Scream, Hellraiser 3 is Dimension's first movie, and I'm like, that's a microcosm of what those first Dimension years were like. Pretty bleak. I've gone back and I've been
associate that era with Leprechaun. I think Leprechaun kind of like signifies what horror, the kind of state that horror was at. Like they were really kind of seeing what would stick to the wall and trying to recreate the magic of mascot horror characters like Freddy and Jason.
Yeah, but I've been reappraising a lot of stuff from that era, and I'm really fascinated to find out, what were the trends, or what was the anti-establishment, what were the reactionary type movies that were being made. And honestly, like Hellraiser 3, underrated or overhated in a lot of ways. It's a pretty fun movie.
It's the only Hellraiser movie you could say is fun. That's my take on that. Like it may be stupid, but it's the only one you could say is actually fun and funny.
Yeah, people are getting killed with CDs. I love it.
Come on, ridiculous.
So that movie is a lot of fun, and Steve and I talk all the time about When a Stranger Calls Back.
Yeah.
Which from the early 90s is super fun, underrated one that a lot of people don't remember. And obviously you got your Misery and your Silence of the Lambs and movies like that early on in the 90s. Jacob's Ladder, Exorcist 3. Like, people were taking some things in interesting directions. I mean, you have slasher movies for about 5 straight years dominating the box office. It's not a surprise that they get stale. If the genre was to be popularized now the way it was then, and we were getting a dozen of them every couple of months for 4 or 5 years straight, I would eventually get sick of them too. I always wondered why critics at the time were so harsh on them. And I'm always like, oh, they're so stuffy and they don't get it. But it's like, I do kind of get it. If your job is reviewing movies and these things are being released by major studios, so many of them at a time, like, yeah, you get tired of them and you don't want to see them anymore. And so I'm starting to notice now how much it changed. Going People Under the Stairs is another one, like going into the 90s from the late 80s. And I think this one is kind of in the early phases of that, where I think they realized like we need something to make this stand out. And it is a big swing because this is pre-City Slickers, this is pre-Tremors. Like you didn't see as much dust in the movies until Tremors 2 years later, which I know, Steve, is a favorite of yours.
Love it.
Yeah. And so, Brad, I'm curious. So this is a movie I kind of feel, so Steve and I have been getting back into ranking these movies. So this is the 50th movie we've done for the show. And so we've been thinking about, okay, well now we were good about it for the first like 5 or 6 episodes, and then we just kind of dropped it completely as a segment. And now we went back and we've been like honing up our list and looking at it. And we won't get too much into that because that's going to be its own episode where we visit all 50 of them quickly and recap and talk about where we think things fall. But you kind of struck me as a guy who maybe with the help of the 88 video a little bit, or maybe not, maybe just perusing the shelves, like you seem to have a fondness for Empire and Full Moon stuff. And the way I've heard you talk on Mates of Hell and your Brain Rot appearances and things like that. So like, where does this kind of fall for you within the pantheon of all the Charles Band stuff? Like, is this something that is kind of towards the cream of the crop for you? Like, would you make a case for this one, or is it kind of more middle of the pack? And if so, like what are the ones you gravitate towards as a horror fan?
I've always had an utmost respect for Charles Band because I mean he's both showman and grifter at the same time, in so much that he's so singularly minded in how films are made. His films are always, we need a monster, build a film around the monster. Now, this is one where there isn't really, you don't call Devlin the main manky hand villain a character in this really, because there's no one really gets an opportunity to breathe. So I would call Ghost Town sort of a mid-tier section, because the way I've described it is it's well shot, no plot. Because it's beautiful to look at.
That's catchy.
Yeah, they should have it on the poster if it ever gets a Scream Factory re-release. But I think it's an aesthetically beautiful film at times, but it is so devoid of narrative beats that I was drifting off in 85 minutes. In terms of what's at the top, the pantheon, the tippy top, I mean, obviously it's Puppet Master, and it's always going to be Puppet Master. I adore those movies. You spoke recently, or at the beginning of the episode, about Ginger Dead Man. That was my choice for our Christmas specials, because I have a bizarre affiliation with the Ginger Dead Man for some bizarre reason, and obviously it's two sequels, Passion of the Crust and Saturday Night Cleaver.
We had a weirdly
Saturday
good
Night
time
Cleaver,
with
yep.
Passion of the Crust. That movie kind of surprised us in a lot of ways. It's still very bad, but it has a lot of very surprising beats in that.
There's some good stuff in there. But then, I also quite enjoy the Demonic Toys films, but I'm not like an Evil Bong fan or anything like that. That's like a step below what I'm willing to accept as a viable movie option.
That's kind of
anybody who listens to this show knows that we are nodding in agreement with you, although may not have been talking on mic. And it's just crazy because I think when you look at Empire from a distance, I mean, since like you mentioned, Brad, this is kind of a movie that's devoid of narrative beats. I feel like that was why we kind of exhausted what you can really say about the movie itself so quickly, because it's not a ton there.
Yeah.
And it's like, we don't want to just keep praising, how nice Mac Allberg made this movie look, like, sure. But I think this is a good opportunity to step back and look at Empire, because this movie to me really signifies this company. I think it was Credit Leonace who kind of pulled a fast one on Charles Band here. And really there was Pulse Pounders and something else I think was also, shelved at the time, which ended up coming out. Pulse Pounders did end up getting released later on. But I think this movie is it's such a beaming example of like the troubles that were happening with the company at the time. And when you look at Empire, it's kind of fascinating to think that all of this happened in such a short period of time.
Yeah.
Because it's like we haven't properly talked about Metal Storm, the destruction of Jared Sin, but that's the movie that the last one I think that predates Empire, and I think Empire formed on the heels of that. And when we talked to Jeffrey Byron, he talked about how quickly they then got up working on the Dungeon Master, which I think became the first proper Empire movie. But then you've got this real succession of Ghoulies and Reanimator and From Beyond and Ghoulies 2, and there's a lot of other little hidden gems in there. A couple of months from now, listeners will hear us talk about the movie Prison, Rennie Harlan movie with Viggo Mortensen. Yeah, super excited to get to that one. And it's just like all of these dolls too. I mean, like, how could you anything in the Empire of Screams box set? Brad, have you picked up that box set from Arrow?
Yeah, it's
Yeah, there you go.
See it where is it? Over there. There it is. There it is.
It's a good one. We were on the waiting list. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was a day one pickup. Obviously, it'd be rude not to. But I mean, a year after this comes out, one of my favorite slasher films of all time. We talk about slashers being dead. Empire made Intruder, which is one of my favorite ever slashers. So there was still life in the old
listeners are listening now, they'll have heard our Intruder with episode with none other than Mike Munzer a few weeks ago.
Oh, and I told him about that film on my first ever episode.
And he did not give you any credit, man. He said Intruder is a movie I've loved since day one.
Bullshit.
He kept saying, I love this movie despite Brad. What? I don't know. It's weird. He kept bringing that up. I wasn't sure why.
He is a liar. I taught him about that film. He lies.
No, Intruder is great, and that's sort of, you look at all the people, and I think there were a lot of visionaries working on Intruder. You know, your Scott Spiegels and your Ted and Sam Raimi's and Lawrence Bender and Roger Avery, people involved in that movie who then went on to have quite prolific careers in the 90s and really make a mark for themselves as filmmakers and storytellers. And I think it's all there. Yeah, I think people forget about Intruder because I think it's flew a little bit under the radar. Like you mentioned, it came out in 89. And I think when you look at 1989 in parentheses next to the name of a slasher movie, and you're kind of like, well, that doesn't fit. This is Jason had already attempted to take Manhattan. It didn't work out well for anyone. And although, you know what, I texted Steve off mic and I said, I've been reappraising that movie and my whole world is turned upside down because I always would say that it was one of the worst movies of the 80s. And now I'm starting to soften on it a little bit. I'm like, I definitely don't think it's good, but I'm like, it's not the worst.
It's the title. It's the title that does it a disservice because it isn't. He doesn't take Manhattan. He goes to Manhattan.
Yeah.
And half the movie is him going there. He get dispatched by some conveniently timed New York City plumbing irrigation systems? Sure, of course he does. But that's what we love about New York. They're always willing to pitch in and help out when they need to.
Well, that's the thing, too. I mean, that movie really was doing the world a favor by letting you know about the 12 midnight toxic waste dump that happens every night here.
Every night.
I just remember.
Yeah,
I just remember when 12, I have an alarm on my clock, and I just have to remember to put my feet up. Just got to put them up on the table.
That's why every New Yorker wears capri pants, just in case.
Everything's coming up, Millhouse.
Well, thank you so much, Brad, for coming on and for bringing this movie to our attention and for literally providing the movie for us. It's been really cool to get a chance to watch it. Where can people find all of your amazing stuff?
So you can find me on all social media platforms, so X, Twitter, Letterboxd, that sort of stuff, at Had Branson. You can follow my podcast that I do with my friend Ash called X Rental. We'll have to get you guys on in a future episode when we're about to start season 2. That will be coming out soon. Yeah, and then otherwise, you can find me on Evolution of Horror and Brain Rot.
Amazing.
I will say, for anybody who has enjoyed listening to Brad talk and is wondering where should I start, I will definitely plug the episode that Stevie, I believe, re-released a few weeks ago of the New York Ripper. That is a terrific episode. I think I heard it back maybe when it originally aired, but I listened to it again on its re-release. And you, Stevie, Alex, it's just such a you can tell like you guys are having such a great time together on that recording. And that's a tough movie to talk about because it is problematic, to say the least.
A smidge.
In a lot of ways, and the way that I think you guys handle it is really funny and really thoughtful. And so if you're looking for a place to dive in, maybe I think it might be even the most recent thing Stevie posted on Brain Rot, or second to most recent. By the time this airs, maybe third or fourth. But New York Ripper. I am a Fulci defender in a lot of ways. I have a hard time defending that movie. Like I really do. Like I love the Gates of Hell trilogy. I will tell anyone to watch that. I don't know that I'll tell everyone to watch the New York Ripper. Like I've seen it a bunch of times. I have the soundtrack on vinyl. I like it. I almost went to a screening of it, and then I decided that people might think poorly of me if they saw me walking in and out of it. So I didn't do that, but Now, New York Ripper episode, terrific episode. Definitely check it out, listeners. And if you like what we do, jump onto Apple Podcasts or Spotify, drop us a quick 5-star rating and maybe a brief review if you feel so inclined. You can follow us on all social media, on Instagram at puppetmasters_castle freaks. You can follow me at _Giallo_Jerry or Steve at Minotaur Matador. We're also on all of the other social media platforms, trying to beef up our YouTube channel a little bit, but we're also on X and Blue Sky and Threads and all of the other places. If you just type the name of this show, these words in this order, you will be able to find it. And this is not the only place where you can find Steve and his sultry voice talking on mic. Steve, where else can people find you?
Well, people can also find me on the show Cinema Arcade. That's cinema and arcade mashed together, because that's what we do. We are watching movies and then playing the video games based off of those movies to see how they enhance or detract or contrast each other. I think our upcoming episode is going to be on Seven Samurai, so I'm going to be spending my afternoon after this recording watching Seven Samurai for the first time in like 15 years, so that's going to be really cool. And there's a very, very bizarre video game that's loosely based on
I was going to say, I had no idea this existed.
It's very similar, except in the video game they fight werewolves and robots.
So not similar at all, then.
Pretty close though. Otherwise, other
if you
than
squint.
And be sure to tune in next week to our show, because we are going to be talking about another movie in our long list of amazing movies here. Another Empire film, and this one's going to be called Slave Girls from Beyond Infinity. Yeah, that's right. That's right. We are going beyond once again, and we've got some very exciting guests on that one as well. So that's going to be a lot of fun.
But we do have a super exciting guest, so make sure that you tune in next week for Slave Girls from Beyond Infinity. Brad, thank you again for joining us, and listeners, we will see you next time.
Thanks, guys.